All right, well, it's the second Sunday in our 7-week fall series where we are working with this book up here called Spiritual Economics by Eric Butterworth. And the subtitle of the book is The Principles and Process of True Prosperity. Because I think too often people get the idea that prosperity has come to be equated with money and possessions. And Eric has a whole different idea about prosperity and what it's all about. In fact, when it comes to money and possessions, there are entire churches that are built around the notion that God wants you to be rich, right? And it always starts with the minister. You know what I'm saying? Right? The minister is the one who has the helicopter, the private jet, the fleet of limousines, and all that good stuff. I have a helicopter. It's about yay big. It has batteries in it. You can fly it around the living room. It's kind of fun. But that whole notion is called the prosperity gospel. We're going to talk more about that next week. And by this, I don't mean to say that there's anything wrong with money and possessions per se, but when spirituality becomes just another way of justifying materialism and consumerism, something's wrong. Especially in light of some of the things that Jesus had to say about possessions and wealth. Some of the most difficult sayings of Jesus speak directly to the question of money and wealth. Time and time again, Jesus would urge his followers to sell all that they have, take the money, give it to the poor, and then follow him. He would say things like, "It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven." And then, in Acts of the Apostles, we find out about how the early Christian communities were organized. The way it worked is that if you wanted to belong, if you wanted to become one of the followers of the way, as they called themselves back then, you would gather all of your possessions. If you owned real estate, you would sell it. You'd bring the money to Peter, and you would literally place it at the feet of Peter, who would then take it and redistribute it to the rest of the members of the community. And there's the story of one couple who failed to do that. They held something back and they both dropped dead. That's the story in Acts of the Apostles. Yes, it's there. And all of the people who are out there who still insist that this is a Christian nation, that you need to take the Bible literally, you can bet they don't take these passages literally, do they? In fact, when you read these passages from the Gospels, and that was just a handful of them, it's a consistent message, you will arrive at an inescapable conclusion. Jesus and his disciples were a bunch of socialists. That's how they organized the community back then. That's what it was. So, did Jesus want people to live in poverty? Well, I don't think so. I don't take these passages literally. There's not much in the Bible that I do take literally. And my take on this is that Jesus knew that his time was short. He didn't have much time to do what it was he wanted to do what he was being called upon to do. So what he needed were people working with him who were just as focused and dedicated as he was, and not distracted by things like working a job, making money, managing a portfolio, managing real estate and things like that. All of that kind of stuff would just get in the way of what Jesus needed from his followers. And so that, no surprise there. The message for the rest of us is to be aware. Be aware of the fact that money and possessions can take over our lives, and they can get in the way of our spiritual growth and well-being. And that's how Eric Butterworth approaches the idea of prosperity. In spiritual economics, Eric is arguing for a much more expansive definition of prosperity. And so here's the definition that he uses. Considered in the broadest sense, prosperity is spiritual well-being. This involves the whole experience of healing life, satisfying love, abiding peace and harmony, as well as a sufficiency of what Aristotle called the furniture of fortune. In other words, stuff. Too often, the tendency is for teacher and student to become so preoccupied with the demonstration of jobs and bank accounts as to forget that the person is a whole creature in a whole universe. And there he zeroes right in on it. The problem is with becoming so preoccupied with demonstration, or as the popular term for it today is manifestation. Thank you, Secret. In fact, he wrote this long before the book The Secret came out, and I think it would be interesting to hear what his commentary would be on that. I don't think he'd like it much, because it is all about manifesting and demonstrating material stuff. That's a small part of it, but it shouldn't be the primary focus, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to get preoccupied. If our idea of prosperity is centered solely on money and possessions, then anything that happens to our money and our possessions, what happens to our stuff, is going to affect our definition of prosperity. If my stuff is being affected, then I'm not prosperous. And that's not the message we're getting here. If our idea of prosperity is centered on things like peace of mind and balanced living, then things in the outer world are going to be a lot less likely to shake us up. I think the key idea in that whole definition of prosperity that Eric gives us is the part about the person being a whole creature in a whole universe. When it comes to realizing true prosperity, we need to shift our attention from strictly material things and focus on our essential unity, the fact that we are all integral and interrelated parts of an abundant and, for all practical purposes, limitless universe. And this is especially important to do whenever we're facing a situation where we think that there isn't enough of something that we think we need. I love this quote from Gary Simmons, who's a Unity minister who writes about prosperity and other things. And this is what he has to say about the experience of not enough. If you ever had not enough of anything, you know how difficult it is not to focus on what you don't have. Not enough can bring you to the edge of your resourcefulness and become a mirror unto your own sense of insufficiency. Think about that. Isn't that a bit of a brain twister? I love that line. You know how difficult it is not to focus on what you don't have. That's great. The experience of not enough brings us to the edge of our resourcefulness. In other words, and we talked about this last week, it presents one of those opportunities. An opportunity to step out and trust what we know. And that's my definition of faith. Faith is trusting what we know to be true. And what we know to be true is that this is an abundant universe. There's more than enough to go around, and the experience of not enough is a temporary blip in the great truth of abundance. Okay, so let's be realistic though. Not enough may be real in the sense that people are unemployed or underemployed. Money is tight in other ways, but the greater reality is that those things are only temporary. But here's the thing. How quickly and how easily they pass is entirely a matter of consciousness. Eric uses a Bible story from the book of Kings in this particular chapter to illustrate how that works. Now, this is one of the miracle stories about the prophet Elisha, who was known as the miracle man. And the story starts out with a woman whose husband has died, and she's left with no money. So she calls on Elisha to help. Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" She answered, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." He said, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels and not just a few. Then go in and shut the door behind you and your children and start pouring into all these vessels. And when each is full, set it aside." So she left him, shut the door behind her and her children, and they kept bringing vessels to her, and she kept pouring. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." But he said to her, "There are no more." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your children can live on the rest." Okay, you might think if Elisha was such hot stuff, right? The miracle man, right? He might have just made money, appear, rain down out of the sky, or at least give her the winning lottery ticket or something like that. But that's just not the way it works in these stories. And it's not the way it works in consciousness either. That first question that Elisha asks is really important. He says, "What do you have in the house?" Right? What's going on in consciousness is what he's saying. What do you have in the house? And her answer reveals her state of consciousness. She says, "I have nothing except a jar of oil." I can almost hear it in real life language. "I ain't got nothing except this lousy jar of oil, fat lot of good that is. It's probably rancid too because I've been hanging on to it forever because that lousy husband of mine was too cheap to buy me any more oil. And it's the only thing I have left. Only a jar of oil." And in his book, Eric talks about that story, and he says that, sometimes a widow suffers from loneliness. Well, this particular widow is suffering from something Eric calls onlyness. Onlyness. And I suspect some of us have suffered from that same malady, right? Because we say, "Oh, I only have so much time. I only have so much energy. I only have so much money," and so on and so forth. And when we think and say things like this, "I have nothing except a jar of oil." I mean, think about that for a minute. You lead off with saying, "I have nothing." Well, then you're going to add something to it? No, you've already kind of set the stage right there. I have nothing except a jar of oil. In the face of not enough, the worst thing we can do is to withdraw and to make our container smaller, or in the case of the widow, practically non-existent. What we're saying, what we're putting out there is, hey, whatever I have, it ain't enough. And you know what? It may as well be nothing if we start with the assumption that it isn't enough. That's how it works out. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not engaging in magical thinking either. We still have to live within our means. But what do we do when something that's unexpected or outside of our control comes along? In this story, the widow's husband, he dies. Her source of income is dried up. Totally unexpected. Well, that's when it's time for a bigger container, which is what Elisha was trying to teach her here. The lesson is that before we can receive more, whether it's oil or money, joy, health, contentment, we have to have enough containers or a large enough container. And so in this story, the container obviously is our consciousness. Is our awareness big enough, expansive enough to embrace the truth that this is an abundant universe? Can we take multiple perspectives? Can we hold sometimes two opposing views in consciousness? Can we expand our consciousness enough to be able to truly affirm that there's more than enough to go around? Those are all the questions we have to look at. Do we embrace possibilities that we can't yet see? Or are we minimizing and shrinking our container in the face of not enough? Some of you Star Trek fans out there might remember something that Spock used to say. He would say, there are always possibilities, right? There are always possibilities. And another thing that he would say, he would talk about infinite diversity in infinite combination. That's what makes those possibilities. And so, hey, if we're shut off from it, we may as well have no container at all. So what do we do in the face of not enough? Well, the widow, again, was suffering from onlyness. Whatever she looked at, it wasn't enough. And the other thing is that she certainly didn't sound very grateful for what she already had. Gratitude is a separate subject. We're going to spend an entire Sunday talking about the power of gratitude when it comes to prosperity. But it's important. And we can make excuses for the widow. We can make excuses or try to explain the situation. She was too upset, too much in shock to see things differently. She was in a state of shock and confusion. That happens sometimes. And that's exactly why we have to practice these principles. That's why we work with this. That's why we go over this time and time again. That's why we work on mindfulness, a meditation practice, so that when the appearance of not enough shows up, we're not going to go into automatic reactive mode, but we're going to have some skills and we're going to have that ability to be able to shift consciousness. It takes practice. So even though we may get thrown off our game temporarily, we get back to the truth. We get back to that which we know to be true. And again, that definition of faith at work. So we have to be on the lookout for those only thoughts, thoughts of lack, thoughts that encourage us to see nothing rather than possibilities. We have to be careful to not identify with lack. Now, those of you who might be familiar with Charles Fillmore's work, our co-founder Charles Fillmore, he once wrote something very controversial in his book that's called Prosperity. Charles actually said in that book, it's a sin to be poor. A lot of people kind of, I remember the first time I heard that, the class had a rather strong reaction to that. And I think he was going for the shock value with it. I think he was going for shock value. He was being provocative. It does get your attention, doesn't it? But let's think for a moment about what he's saying. The word poor is interesting because we use that word in several different ways, right? I can hold up a drawing and I can say it's a pretty poor drawing, right? What am I really saying? I'm saying that it is not very skillful, it's not very good, and yet we use that same word to talk about people and their financial situation. It's one thing to say that somebody lives in poverty, because all we're saying there is that their income is below what has been objectively measured as needing to be sufficient in order to live, to be able to afford sufficient food and housing and different things like that. So the word poverty is one thing, but when we use the word poor and apply it to a person, isn't that interesting? So Charles, he's not saying it's a sin to not be able to pay your bills. What he's saying is that it's wrong to start identifying yourself and your essence with what you don't have. To use that word poor to describe the essence of who you are, especially because it has that other meaning of something that's not very good, not very well done. It's interesting. It's wrong to identify with not enough. So I really think he was onto something there. In the book Spiritual Economics, Eric uses a quote from Mike Todd, who was a great film and theater producer. Probably most people today know of him as one of Elizabeth Taylor's many husbands, I guess. But Eric uses a quote from Mike Todd, who once said, "Many times I have been broke, but I have never been poor." That's pretty good. And actually there's a corollary to that from a bluegrass song that I like, which goes like this. I ain't broke, but brother, I'm badly bent. That's pretty good. I ain't broke. Don't call me broke. I'm just a little bent. So it's all about our state of mind. It's all about our awareness. And it starts with being aware of the basic unity of all life, what Eric calls being a whole creature in a whole universe, which carries with it this idea of the truth of abundance. So that's what we have to contemplate and imprint on our awareness if we want to experience the kind of prosperity that Eric is talking about. So that's all for today. Next week we will pick up with the topic of spiritual materialism. Yes, believe it or not, there is such a thing, and hope to see you then. Thank you.